David Ripplinger, Bioenergy, Bioproducts, Economic Specialist, NDSU Extension. I'm going to talk about canola as a biofuel feedstock. This year, been a lot of developments in the last few months, and so a lot of things have been going on. Developments, particularly in the United States. Trade tariffs is kind of top of mind, but a lot of things going on in biofuel policy uh, led by developments in Washington, are really starting to paint a picture or give us some idea of what things are going to look like here in the near future. And really, what has to be done is some education, so folks understand the true carbon intensity of canola, which is really, really important. And then we might have canola farmers more so than any other farmers in the United States be very motivated to make or to at least document their practices to make sure that their carbon intensity is a bit smaller. So first chart, just looking at this is all biomass-based diesel just in the United States, even though it's very much a global product. We've seen this dramatic increase in renewable diesel production. It's going to continue. The question is, what ingredients are we going to use to make it? And we have a pretty good idea of where we're going to be going the next year or so. But this chart shows, what's been used to date for the most part. And again, it's a lot of soybeans. This is still dominated in some respects for biodiesel. The growth has been with used cooking oil, grease, and the like, which has really kind of filled in that renewable diesel spot for California because it has a small carbon intensity. And of course, we see this canola number for the U.S., which is relatively sizable and growing, which is a good sign. But again, that's for the U.S. If we look at imports, this gives us a better picture because so much of the U.S. industry is located in Canada. So much of the canola industry is based in Canada for all of North America. A lot of biodiesel production, and a lot of that comes here in the U.S. For consumption. That ends up, in large part, I mean, a lot of it does end up in California, but all over the country to meet different needs. Going to hit you with a barrage of not exciting news. The first is that California, which has its low carbon fuel standard, has created this market for low carbon fuels, especially biofuels, has implemented a cap on the use of vegetable oil for biomass based diesel, so for both biodiesel and renewable diesel. This is not bullish. And especially what we have right now, if we look at what different feedstocks have been used in California recently, we have it broken up by both the fuel, the BD is for biodiesel, the RD is for renewable diesel. And what we can see is, especially just written in text, we're right at that 20% level already. And so this is, again, a cap on what could be used. There could be shifts. There's some room for growth within these different products, but it ends up being a bit of a stumbling block. Very good news that essentially offsets this is that California also said, the industry has responded. We've brought renewable diesel to market in scale, and so in response to that, we're going to increase our goal, even though it's tough language. Their goal originally was to reduce emissions for fuel by 20%. Now they said, you know what, let's get that closer to 30%, and going through to by 2030 to have that change. And so we've seen, the graph kind of helps illustrate it a little bit, going from where we were at in 2010, 2011 to the initial goal being this 20%. And the next thing would be this line, that green line, which was actually realized, just continuing to steeply decline to hit a -30. So again, even like lower on your screen is where we need to go. And you can do that two ways. One, you could just have 50% more of all of the same fuel, or you could have more lower carbon feedstocks. Again, this provides opportunity for a lot of growth. And again, that's what we were expecting even before this. Obviously we had a ways to go to get to that 20% reduction, which would have meant, some combination of biofuel. Now we're saying that the goal is significantly bigger. And so how do we get from where we're at today to the future? For biofuels as a whole, very bullish. For biomass-based diesel, include biodiesel and renewable diesel, very, very positive in terms of a growing market. But the actual allocation, how that's going to fall out, is somewhat up to question. In California, they very much value low carbon feedstocks, and so that's why we've seen tallow and used cooking oil play such a big role. At the same time, if we look nationally, that's somewhat the case, but the incentive structure isn't exactly the same. The biggest piece of news, and something that the story for canola oil is really different than it is for other crops, in large part is due to some recent proposed guidance from the federal government regarding 45Z. So by now, if you're a producer, you should know the abbreviation, that 45Z, that acronym 45Z, for the part of the tax code for this production credit. It's important because it's the new big placeholder, the all-encompassing placeholder for federal tax credits for biofuels, and it extends to other low carbon fuels as well. But it's for the most part, we're talking about biofuels. It's very important for canola and other folks because we've long benefited from having this biodiesel blenders tax credit, which has been $1 a gallon. It also replaces a SAF tax credit, was just created or went into force last year. But just by the idea that it's going to replace something that has been beneficial to the industry is something to note. What it does allow is now you can have a credit up to $1.75 if you make SAF. So again, this is low carbon jet fuel, up to $1 for all other biofuels. And it's important to note too, so we're saying up to $1. So you'd max it out at the same level you would have been before. And what is nice about this to some extent is it's based on the carbon intensity of the fuel. And so if you have an incremental change in your the carbon footprint of your fuel, be that made at the refinery level or at the farm level and the specific farm, you can be incentivized for that. So that's really interesting, exciting as an economist, because it gives you that incentive, that benefit from making that change. So it should really work well in terms of having farmers make that decision at the margin. Should I adopt a new practice? Should I use a different input? Should I make a certain investment? A little bit of an update, and there's also just a general update. We've certainly had the change in administration. Their general guidance is not as supportive of certainly not climate, which is been directly addressed almost immediately upon the change of administration in a variety of ways. And it also leads one to think that effort to finalize rules for 45Z are going to be somewhat weak. And so anyways, in January, this was actually under the previous administration, on the 10th, so a week and a half before the new administration took place, they did issue some information. So they said it was like an intent to propose guidance, as opposed to a proposed rule, which would have started started this rulemaking process, which we have to go through. But there was some information in that. They did, it happened to be Argonne National Lab, DOE, did release a new Greek calculator. So this is the tool used to calculate the carbon footprint of a fuel. And then the USDA had some additional language, and then also has a tool for estimating feedstock emissions. The overall signal from this kind of is taken by industry is that there's not enough certainty, that the more was known on January 10th than there was on the 9th. This actually came out in a series of days. The proposed guidance from the IRS, from the Treasury Department, came out on the 10th. Additional information, but still a long ways to go, as well as a lot of thoughts about how effective this is going to be at really impacting, incentivizing folks to document their practices, to make changes, because there simply wasn't enough there, or some of the decisions that were made weren't quite as supportive of making those types of decisions and investments. So an important rule within 45Z is that to get any tax credit, your CI score has to be below a certain level. And so it happens to be 50 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per MMBTU. So it's emissions relative to the amount of energy. So that's set in the law. Um, and anything below that, as you get below that, you can get an incremental payment for an incremental tax credit for continuing to get below that number. Using some information, this comes from the American Soybean Association, and the numbers can vary a little bit because you can provide user-based information. But if we look at this table and we go across the top, so each column is a different feedstock. So soybean oil, canola, used cooking oil, tallow, and corn oil. And then each row is a different product. In the case of sustainable aviation fuel, you can use one of two calculators to estimate what the carbon intensity is. But this table shows the calculation. So if you look at that second column of canola oil, you see a 77.4 and so forth. All of those are above 50. And so that's not where one would want to be. Again, because until you get below 50, there's no tax credit. And again, these are general numbers, generalized numbers. And also just from not even a proposed rule, but some guidance provided by the government. So this is not officially final, or there's a long way to go before it could be finalized and changed. But that gives you a hint that canola oil generally is on the wrong side of things. And again, this is important. One, you have the ability or inability to get a tax credit. But there's also this thought, what can I do? Is this number right or close to right? Are there things that I can do or document, again, when this would be fully rolled out, for me to document some things that go on my farm? So what inputs do I use? What yield do I have? What practices do I use? So those numbers, canola oil used to produce these products, for certain canola oil produced with canola from certain farms, could and almost certainly would be below 50. But as a general kind of benchmark or general estimate right now, that's not where things are sitting. And just as I mentioned, so you have to be below that. And again, if current guidance holds, you're going to be on the wrong side. Different production practices that you might have, especially related to tillage, which are there, really kind of limited with the guidance that, or the use of cover crops, or nitrogen release products, which those are the only three things that were included in the USDA guidance and the USDA tool. Those would get you, certainly in the case of no-till, that would get a farmer below the line for some, a canola farmer below the line for some of these things. But again, a lot more that will likely become clear depending on how fast the current administration moves things. And again, they could change any of the estimates within the calculator. They could change the different practices, the parameters that they use on their side to help calculate these numbers. Finally, talking just a little bit about trade, it certainly related to agriculture, biofuels, energy, disproportionately so between our countries than most other products, because we have such immense amount of material crossing the border in both directions. One of the most important things to note is we hear the 25% tariff, and so that's for almost everything. But there's three specific areas where the rate was actually 10%, and so that happens to include energy, including biofuels. So when we talk about the U.S. tariff on imports from Canada, if you hear the 25%, that's correct for everything except for this. It's that 10%. It's important in our context, but maybe not when you're talking to 20 million people on TV, so you don't get that detail. Just kind of walking through again where we're at, going back 2 months ago, tariffs were announced, the idea that they would begin in February. On February 1st, an executive order was signed. So they would start according to order on February 4th. On the 3rd, they suspended it. And then, just a little less than 2 weeks ago, they went into effect. And so the tariffs in this case, 25% for most things, 10% for energy. The Canadians, in terms of retaliation, have imposed a 10% import tariff on material going from the U.S. into Canada. And again, that's sitting there now. And of course, just a few days after that, USMCA trade items, as defined in that, were decided to be exempt until April 2nd. So we're in this period right now where there's no import tariffs for a lot of these products related to canola, including biofuel, and then also just energy and crude oil generally. But within 3 weeks, unless something changes, and it certainly could, that's what we would expect is having these tariffs. Related things to this, just earlier this week, late last week, Canada announced that it's investigating the dumping of renewable diesel. This was in response to a claim made by a renewable diesel company in British Columbia, saying that the U.S. subsidizes renewable diesel production, which would be the case for 45Z. If a refiner is receiving that and selling below what the cost would have been otherwise, and using that to subsidize that sale, that would be dumping. We'll see how that goes, but pretty big event in terms of trade if all of these other things weren't happening. And then finally, one of the big pieces, and it hits all of canola, but it has this bioenergy impact. China's looking at 100% duties on all canola imports from Canada. That would be a really big issue because all of a sudden, if China is not taking canola and/or canola oil, that canola oil, either in crude form or still in the seed, is going to be in North America. And that's going to mean, in many respects, that North America is going to be awash in this material. And depending where you're at, that could be a good thing. If you want to buy it, that's great. If you're a producer, supplier, not so much. And so a lot of side issues. And again, the China duty would be tremendous in terms of the impact on Canada and consequently on the U.S. just because we have this relationship, and even with a 25% tariff, that decision by China would significantly impact U.S. Canadian canola economics, and so it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. And of course, that's due to issues completely outside of the U.S. Canadian trade dispute right now. So those were my prepared remarks. I'm happy to answer any questions. There's a lot going on. Long term, canola has a place because it's a relatively low carbon feedstock at scale. How it's going to play out in the next year, the next 2-3 years is a bit of a question mark. Again, there's a lot of rulemaking that has to be done in the next few months, hopefully in the next year. Some clarification and some build out of these calculators will be done. And so, hopefully those numbers end up being advantageous to canola. This is actually an interesting point too, where you want to have good numbers. And I'm not completely read up on where canola's numbers are with Greek because the model just came out. But in a lot of cases, their representative yields are not what we're actually seeing. They're significantly lower than we actually see in the countryside, right? Because you're trying to maximize profit. And so, you're trying to push the yield. At the same time, in some cases, you might have higher levels of input use. And again, because as a producer, you're trying to push down input use. And so actually getting those real numbers as 45Z allows almost certainly provides a window. And so that individual kind of farmer field level perspective is helpful. But in general, it would be very nice for for the crop to have a lower carbon intensity generally, so you don't have as far to go. And a lot of this is, it's driven by science. I mean, obviously, there's certainly some politics in it, which is kind of outside my purview. But making sure that folks have good numbers, and sometimes those numbers end up coming from universities, end up coming from uh, uh, commodity groups to make sure that they have the right stuff. That in this case is absolutely crucial, especially going forward. So happy to answer any questions that you might have. And the one thing I would note with absolute certainty is please note the date. It's March 14th. A week from now, things could be quite different. I don't know how quickly the federal government's going to move on making 45Z rules or updating calculators, but it could happen, uh, you know, certainly any week, any month coming up, hopefully to the benefit of producers.